Just a word before I begin my reflection. I know for many of us, it's probably been a kind of tough week and a half. And this is the first time I've had a chance to be up here. So if anybody would like to join me, probably back in the kind of the middle school room there, say 11:15, 11:30 or so, after you've had a chance to do some fellowship, everyone wants to talk about what's been going on. I'd certainly be glad to sit down with a group of people that might be interested in this. So, just a thought. Ours is no caravan of despair. Ours is no caravan of despair. I'm not sure how many of us could have sung these words of Jalaluddin Rumi, at least honestly and sincerely, on the morning of November 9th. Certainly for the partisans among us, the election loss of Secretary Clinton was, like most election losses, a bitter defeat. The sense that months, if not years, of hard work had come to naught. But for me at least, and perhaps for many others, this particular election outcome had a different, more troublesome feel to it. It felt like a repudiation of our deepest, most dearly held fundamental values. We felt like we'd been thrown into an abyss, not sure where or when we might emerge. This election seemed to be more about more than just policy differences. It really represented the opening of a chasm in the framework of our country that we may fear cannot be repaired. Now, to be fair, I'm sure that the folks on the other side of our political divide have felt this way the morning after other elections, have felt their own sense of despair. I remember the reaction of my mother in my own Lutheran home in 1960 when that Catholic, John F. Kennedy, was elected in another nail-biter. My mother was convinced that I would, and she said this to me, by the way, that I would not be able to continue my Lutheran catechism studies once he took over. Now, to be fair to my mother, well, she never really came to support the Kennedys, and as I've learned later, may have had some good personal reasons for that reaction. She mourned with the rest of the nation that traumatic weekend in 1963 after JFK was killed. Now, an election loss like this one can pose particular challenges to Unitarian Universalists. Again, leaving aside our particular public policy preferences, our fifth principle affirms the right of conscience and the use of the democratic process within our congregations and in society at large. The Mayflower Compact, devised by our Pilgrim forebears, was one of the first written statements affirming democracy in the American colonies and set the basis for the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, which together created the framework of our form of government, however imperfect it may seem at times. Every election cycle, we celebrate the citizenry, or at least the half of them that participate, who cast their ballots and make their choices. Some of us, perhaps a bit more hardcore, knock on doors, make phone calls, stuff envelopes, and otherwise promote the candidates of our choice, and then celebrate their victories or mourn their defeats. As much as we celebrate the winners in any election, I would like to argue that it is really the behavior of those on the losing side, who demonstrate the vibrancy of our political system. What is most remarkable to me is about our democratic system of government is the peaceful transition of power following each election. Only once in 1860 did the losing side reject the decision of the electorate and attempt to gain by force of arms what they could not achieve at the ballot box. And of course the Civil War followed, and the decision of the voters ultimately prevailed. But is the behavior of the losing side, grumbling about the outcome, and like generations of Cubs fans everywhere, vowing that next time it will be different, and lo and behold, it was in 2016. But that is, in my view, the hallmark of our democracy. Many who did not get the result they desired in this election are already thinking about and planning for next time. Now, this does not mean that those on the losing side are required to accept the actions of the winners without complaint. Following an election, it is often said that we wish the new president or governor or etc. well, and that if he succeeds, then we all succeed. Well, I want to take a little bit of a contrarian view on that one. I don't necessarily want the winner to succeed if success means that policies, which I believe are bad for the country in general, are implemented. I personally don't want to see a wall built along the Mexican border, or millions of people deported, or the Iran nuclear weapons deal scrapped, or the United States walk away from the Paris Climate Accord. These things may happen because of the outcome of the election, but I will not consent to them or support them. However, as a citizen of this country, I will be bound by them because that's the democratic process. So where does this leave us? For many, it revolves around the political process, finding different candidates, different platforms, more accurate polls, better get out the vote strategies, more effective advertising, better use of social media. All of these are an attempt to use the political process to achieve a desired outcome in future elections. To me, though, this is too narrow a response to this election outcome. The challenges that we face are too immediate for us to wait until the next election cycle. While working to make our voices heard through political and governmental process is important, it is not sufficient. In the 1830s, a young French diplomat and scholar, Alexis de Tocqueville, traveled throughout the United States, ostensibly to observe the workings of the prison system. But in reality, he was gathering information about this new republic across the Atlantic, whose birth was aided by France. He recorded his observations in a 2-volume work which came to be known as Democracy in America, which was published in 1835 and 1840. Among the topics that he covered was one that he called associations, or what we today might call voluntary associations or civil society. For de Tocqueville, these associations were not political groups or business entities. Rather, they are, quote, associations of 1,000 other kinds: religious, moral, serious, feudal, general or restricted, enormous or diminutive. The Americans make associations to give entertainments, to found seminaries, to build inns, to construct churches, to diffuse books, to send missionaries to the Antipodes. In this manner, they found hospitals and prisons and schools. If it is proposed to inculcate some truth or to foster some feeling by the encouragement of a great example, they form a society. Wherever at the head of some new undertaking you see a government in France or a person of rank in England, in the United States, you will be sure to find an association. From de Tocqueville's perspective, the concept of association is more pervasive in democratic as opposed to aristocratic societies. In aristocratic societies, there are small groups of powerful people who can achieve their goals if they wish to do so. In democratic societies, it's different. De Tocqueville writes, among democratic nations, on the contrary, all the citizens are independent and feeble. They can do hardly anything by themselves, and none of them can oblige his fellow men to lead him in their assistance. I'm not going to struggle over the pronouns in this. I ask you to simply remember the time in which it was written. They all therefore become powerless if they do not learn voluntarily to help one another. If persons living in democratic countries had no right and no inclination to associate for political purposes, Their independence, excuse me, I've got to get something to keep my throat working. I had to cough for a couple of weeks. I really do feel better than I sound. So. They all, therefore, become powerless if they do not learn voluntarily to help one another. If persons living in democratic countries had no right and no inclination to associate for political purposes, their independence would be in jeopardy, but they might long preserve their wealth and its cultivation. Whereas if they never acquired the habit of forming associations in ordinary life, civilization itself would be endangered. A people among whom individuals lost the power of achieving great things single-handed without acquiring the means of producing them by united exertions would soon relapse into barbarism. Note that de Tocqueville is talking about persons coming together outside of the formal political realm to advance their goals. This provides an avenue for exertion of power and influence even where political power is in other hands. Now, in the 20th century, liberal theologian and Unitarian Universalist minister James Luther Adams came to a similar conclusion. In the 1930s, Adams, then a professor and scholar, traveled to Germany, where he observed the rise to Hitler and the Nazis. From his experience, he came to understand the meaning of resistance to developing oppression, and he came to understand how voluntary association tied into such resistance. He wrote, "Gradually I came to the conviction that a decisive institution of the viable democratic society is the voluntary association as a medium for the assumption of civic responsibility. As a result, I plunged into the voluntary associational activity, concerning myself with race relations, civil liberties, housing problems. I joined the newly formed acquaintances in the founding of the Independent Voters of Illinois, and I began to learn firsthand about moral man and immoral society. I traveled to Washington fairly often to consult with persons like Adlai Stevenson, Jonathan Daniels, and Harold Ickes regarding Chicago politics. At the same time, I participated in precinct organization, becoming a doorbell ringer and also consulting with party leaders in back rooms. There was nothing intrinsically unusual about all of this. It was only unusual for the Protestant churchman or clergyman." Again, Adams saw the connection between persons coming together outside of the governmental structure to pursue policy ends they believe in. Now, to be sure, Adams had a more political bent than did de Tocqueville, who looked at the non-political aspects of voluntary association. But the approach was the same. Individuals coming together and creating organizations to pursue their own goals. Now, I want to make it clear that I'm not now suggesting that our current situation is necessarily the equivalent to Nazi Germany in the 30s, though, to be sure, recent activities and actions since the election, especially the strong presence of the so-called alt-right and white nationalist elements among those forming the new administration, troubled me greatly. What Adams emphasized is that we must be prepared to resist actions by those in power, and that voluntary association, groups of people getting together, is an effective way to do that. Many of the proposals and policy prescriptions advanced by the winning side in the recent election may fly in the face of the values many of us hold dear. Take immigration policy as one example. While we may differ on what a just and workable immigration system looks like, wholesale deportation of undocumented persons without regard to their individual circumstances, the impact on their families, is not, in my view, a reflection of our values. It certainly is not a reflection of mine. Also, policies that would effectively discriminate against persons from Muslim countries, or at the more extreme, require persons of the Islamic faith to register with the government, would be an affront to our religious principles as well as the U.S. Constitution. And arguing that the internment of Japanese civilians during World War II serves as a precedent for such actions is even more, shall I say it, deplorable. We might say, well, these things won't happen here or now, yet those offering these seemingly fringe proposals have gotten an ear at the very highest levels of power. But even if we back off from these extreme ideas, there are going to be other circumstances where we will need to come together as part of voluntary coalitions. Take something as uncontroversial and seemingly straightforward as hunger. In recent years, nutrition assistance programs such as food stamps have been a target for those trying to find ways to cut the budget to pay for unwarranted and, in my view, unjustifiable tax cuts. While we must make the political fight against such cuts, we must also strengthen the capacity of our food banks and food pantries to make sure that people living in the richest country on earth don't go to sleep hungry. We must also work to protect voting rights and civil liberties, preserve the access of women at all economic levels to exercise their constitutional right to reproductive choice, and prevent the rollback of the right of all persons to legally marry. But these are just a few examples to make a larger point. An election has been lost, a bitter defeat again for many of us, but the issues and principles many people fought for have not gone away. There are still hungry people. There are still undocumented immigrants living in the shadows, fearing that their loved ones may be torn from them, with no current hope of a more rational system to deal with their problems. There are still persons of the Muslim faith being viciously attacked for simply openly practicing their religion. Voting rights are still under attack. There are those who would dearly love to roll back the freedom to marry. As Unitarian Universalists, we must come together with others to try to preserve the rights of others, especially those less able to advocate for themselves. And we do this as people of faith. Now, this is a hard word for us sometimes to use, but I embrace it, people of faith. And it's described in this way by James Luther Adams. The faith of a church or of a nation is an adequate faith only when it inspires and enables people to give of their time and their energy to shape the various institutions, social, economic, and political, of the common light. A faith in the commanding, sustaining, transforming reality is one that tries to shape history. Any other faith is thoroughly undependable. It is also, in the end, impotent. It is not a faith that molds history. It is a faith that enables history to crush humanity. Its ministry prepares people to adjust to the crushing by focusing on and salving the personal experiences of hurt. That's what we got to do now. And that's what we need. That's why we need to do it. Blessed be.